Memory. The pioneer of memory studies was Hermann Ebbinghaus, whom I discussed in a previous segment. He tested his own memory by trying to memorize meaningful words and then a bunch of nonsensical syllables. He concluded our memory favors things that are meaningful to us, as well as how long we expose ourselves to them and how long after we want to retrieve them. So, we remember things that have certain use to us the longer we spend time dealing with those things, and finally how soon we need those things. So, unlike a computer, human memory is purpose-driven and time-sensitive. To understand human memory, let's discuss how the human brain makes decisions. As Shakespeare's Hamlet holding a human skull and asking what to remember and what not to remember. Then once it has decided what to remember, how does it do it? Beluma Zygarnik, who was born in 1901 and died in 1988, was a Russian psychologist who studied how the brain is biased towards unfinished tasks. When researching, she found that when a task was incomplete due to an interruption, the participants were more likely to remember the task. For example, waiters were more likely to remember customers who hadn't paid than those who had paid. In other words, the memory is biased towards a task that is yet to be completed. The brain forgets the task that is done. This phenomena is now known as Zeigarnik effect, which means our memory retains more when we have regular breaks. So the brain prioritizes things to be done. This is also called the working memory because the task is not complete and needs our attention. Now that we understand that our memory favors an incomplete task rather than completed tasks, how does it do it? George Miller, who was born in 1920 and died in 2012, was an American psychologist who took up William James's distinction between short-term and long-term memory by focusing on how short-term memory really worked. Incidentally, he also worked at MIT with Noam Chomsky, whose theory of universal grammar sits at the heart of linguistics, and also co-founded the Harvard Center for Cognitive Studies. Miller used the data processing of a computer as a model to study how the human mind handles short-term memory. In his famous paper with a mouthful title, The Magical Number 7, Plus or Minus 2, Some Limits on Our Capacity for Processing Information, in 1956, he argued that memory is not one giant storage space, but rather divided and organized like an efficient system, somewhat similar to a channel that information flows through. When we perceive information, it goes through our short-term or working memory. But since our short-term memory has limited storage capacity, it has to deal with information overload. How does it do it? It organizes information into categories or meaningful chunks, just like any large processing system. Once those meaningful chunks are created, they are easier to store in long-term memory. A good analogy would be how a library stores its endless books. It divides them into categories and subcategories. Miller realized that there was a certain limit to our working memory. It's like our digestive system. The food goes through our mouth, where larger ones are crushed into sizable chunks because our esophagus has limited capacity. Of course, when it comes to information, it's not a physical phenomena but a mental one, so you don't need teeth to crush information. So the limit is not physical but rather a mental processing limit. He settled on number 7. In many studies prior, he observed that the human mind could generally keep up or hold attention for up to 7 elements or chunks of information. Once we are bombarded by more than 7, the memory prioritizes some and ignores the other. A water dam is perhaps a good analogy as it channels water into streams, but since water is a physical matter, the dam bursts when overloaded. The human mind, however, might ignore it first, but if it cannot, it becomes stressed and we might have emotional outbursts when overloaded with too many voices or too many things to remember. But one of the best mechanisms of dealing with information overload is perhaps our long-term memory, where we store things we don't need right now. So the question is, how do we retrieve information once it's stored in our long-term memory? Alvin Tolding, who was born in 1927, an Estonia-born Canadian psychologist who, instead of studying how the memory stores information, focused on how we retrieve the stored memory. Just like Ebbinghaus, Tulving used words to test how memory worked. He used his students as subjects and read a list of words to them. Then he asked them to recall those words. Most of his students were able to recall about 50%. Then, to see if there was any difference, he gave them hints or organized those words into categories like color, animals, food, tools, transport, etc. His students were able to recall more. He concluded that memory works much better when information is organized or compartmentalized into neat categories. Not only that, Tulving also discovered that there was a distinction between two types of long-term memory: semantic memory, where you store factual information like data, and episodic memory, where you store experiential information like an event or conversation. As a result, he made a distinction as to how we remember and retrieve those memories. Facts and figures are recalled based on meaningful categories like words related to certain group. But episodic memory is retrieved not so much by their categories, but by the time and often place, because those memories are often emotional ones. So he called the retrieval of this kind of memory more akin to time travel to a particular event like a birthday or a party, etc. This episodic memory is beautifully depicted in Marcel Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time, in which he used sensory triggers like smell, sound, taste, touch that can involuntarily transport us to the past event or people we have forgotten. So time and place are extremely crucial when it comes to episodic memory. With semantic or knowledge-based memory, Proust called it voluntary memory, in that we can voluntarily recall them. Tulving also said that besides semantic and episodic memories, there was a third type of long-term memory, which he called procedural memory, where we store skills. For example, skills such as driving, cooking, riding, bike, or certain crafts, or even playing sports are part of this procedural memory. So to sum up, Tulving used unorthodox techniques to observe long-term memory and divide it into two: factual knowledge or emotional experience. While we can retrieve factual information by organizing them into categories, we retrieve emotional experiences through time and place.